You begin at the edge of Anatolia in the late 13th century, where a world in transition is about to give birth to something no one could have predicted. The land is fractured, a checkerboard of small beyliks, Turkish principalities carved out of the ruins of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, and hanging over everything is the shadow of the Mongols, who had come crashing into the Middle East like an unstoppable storm. Entire kingdoms had already been erased, and even mighty cities had burned. The Seljuks, once proud rulers, had been reduced to vassals, humiliated by Mongol domination. It is in this climate of uncertainty, fear, and opportunity that the seeds of the Ottoman Empire were planted. You might imagine a beginning full of pomp, with banners flying and a glorious proclamation of destiny, but the truth is far humbler. The Ottomans didn't start as conquerors of half the known world. They started as a small frontier tribe with little more than grazing lands, a loyal band of warriors, and a charismatic leader. These were the Oghuz Turks, nomads who had been drifting westward for centuries, following the ebb and flow of steppe migrations, wars, and shifting alliances. Their culture was steeped in the traditions of the steppe: horseback warfare, clan loyalty, and the fierce independence of a people who lived with the horizon as their boundary. Among these tribes was one led by a man named Ertugrul. You could picture him as a pragmatic warrior, hardened by decades of uncertainty, fighting for survival more than for glory. The story goes, part history, part legend, that Ertugrul and his followers aligned themselves with the Seljuks and earned land in the northwest corner of Anatolia. This was frontier country, right at the border between Christian Byzantium and the Muslim lands further east. To outsiders, it may have seemed like a dangerous backwater, but for Ertugrul's descendants, it was a gold mine of opportunity. And this is the critical point. The Ottomans weren't born in a vacuum. They grew out of geography. They sat on a fault line where East met West, Islam faced Christendom, and the decaying Byzantine Empire rubbed shoulders with ambitious Turkish beyliks. Every raid, every alliance, every skirmish here was a chance to grow stronger. It was survival of the bold. Now it is worth pausing to reflect on how tiny the Ottoman beginnings were compared to what they would become. By the end of the 13th century, Osman, Ertugrul's son, would inherit leadership of what was still just one small principality. Imagine a few thousand soldiers at most, a capital that was little more than a fortified town, and neighbors who were often just as powerful, if not stronger. Nobody in 1299, the symbolic founding year often given to the empire, would have looked at Osman Beylik and thought, "Ah yes, the next great superpower of the world." No, it was just another piece of the Anatolian patchwork. But what set them apart? Historians debate this endlessly. Some point to the Ottomans' uncanny ability to adapt, to absorb different cultures, and to use religion as both a unifying force and a justification for conquest. Others highlight their geopolitical luck. Being positioned right on the crumbling Byzantine frontier gave them easy targets and endless opportunities for raids. And then there's leadership. Osman and his successors were not just skilled fighters, but shrewd strategists who knew how to play friends and enemies alike. Still, in this first phase, you're not seeing imperial grandeur yet. You're seeing raids, small, fast, opportunistic. Turkish warriors called Ghazis rode out under the banner of jihad, fighting the Byzantines and other Christians on the frontier. But don't be fooled into thinking this was purely ideological. Sure, religion played its role, but booty, land, and prestige were equally powerful motivators. These men weren't monks, they were frontier raiders. And Osman, clever as he was, knew how to channel that restless energy into something more enduring. And this is where the myth-making begins. The Ottomans always loved a good origin story, and later chroniclers would retroactively inflate their beginnings into something grand and almost divinely ordained. Osman, in particular, became the stuff of legend. There's the famous Dream of Osman, where he supposedly saw a tree sprouting from his chest, its branches shading the world, a symbolic prophecy of his dynasty's future greatness. Did this dream really happen? Almost certainly not. But did it matter? Not at all. Myths like this gave the Ottomans a sense of destiny, a narrative that their expansion wasn't just random luck, but the fulfillment of divine will. At this point, you might be tempted to see the Ottomans as inevitable, as if history had already chosen them to rise above all their neighbors. But that's hindsight talking. In reality, dozens of beyliks dotted Anatolia at the same time. Some were stronger, richer, and older than Osman's little principality. So why did the Ottomans, out of all of them, survive and thrive? Part of the answer lies in timing. The Byzantine Empire, already weakened by centuries of decline, was practically begging to be picked apart. The Mongols, who had terrified the world, were pulling back and fragmenting. The stage was wide open for bold leaders to step forward. Osman was simply in the right place, at the right moment, with the right skills. And so the Ottomans began to expand. First cautiously, then more boldly. They pushed into Byzantine territory, seizing towns and fortresses, each one strengthening their hold. They absorbed rival Turkish beyliks when possible, fought them when necessary. Every conquest fed into a growing sense of permanence. By the time Osman died around 1323 or 1324, he left his son Orhan not just a tribe, but the beginnings of a state. But that is jumping ahead. Right now, at the very dawn of their story, the Ottomans are still just another small player on a chaotic frontier. You, as the observer, are standing on a dusty Anatolian plain, watching mounted warriors ride off under the banner of a leader who is ambitious, but not yet legendary. The empire they will build lies entirely in the future. What matters here, in these first decades, is survival, opportunity, and ambition. The Ottoman story, like all great stories, doesn't start with inevitability. It starts with uncertainty. A people on the edge of history, making choices that, at the time, probably felt like nothing more than short-term survival. And yet those choices, one raid at a time, one alliance at a time, would snowball into something that would one day dominate half the world. When Osman inherited leadership from his father Ertuğrul, the Ottomans were still, by all reasonable accounts, a modest frontier principality. Yet, within a single generation, they began to take shape as something far more formidable. This is where the entire history of the Ottomans begins to accelerate, and it's Osman himself who gives the dynasty not just its name, but its sense of direction. Now, here's the thing about Osman. Our sources are frustratingly thin. The man lived in a period where chronicles were sparse records, spotty, and much of what we know about him was written decades or even centuries later by Ottoman historians who had every reason to embellish their founder's story. So Osman is less a flesh and blood figure in the way we know a Julius Caesar or a Napoleon, and more of a blend of fact, legend, and propaganda. Still, enough survives to give us a sense of the man. Osman emerges as a pragmatic and ambitious leader. He wasn't ruling from palaces or writing letters to philosophers. No, he was on horseback, directing raids against the Byzantine frontier, making alliances with neighboring Turkish lords, and carving out small territories whenever opportunity presented itself. His followers were Ghazis, those frontier warriors driven by both religious zeal and the promise of loot. Osman gave them direction, legitimacy, and most importantly, success. Success attracts followers, and followers build states. The Byzantines at this point were practically begging to be conquered. Their empire, once a glorious continuation of Rome, had been steadily shrinking for centuries. By the late 13th and early 14th centuries, they were stretched thin, crippled by internal strife, and losing their grip on Anatolia. To the Ottomans, this meant one thing: easy targets. Osman's men raided towns, harassed fortresses, and crucially, began to settle into the lands they captured. Unlike some other beyliks that preferred quick raids and returns, Osman's followers had the knack for establishing permanence. This wasn't smash-and-grab warfare, this was state-building by degrees. One of Osman's most famous victories was the capture of Baphius in 1302, a battle against Byzantine forces that gave the Ottomans a significant morale boost and territorial foothold. To you, sitting centuries later, it might sound like just another frontier skirmish, but at the time, it was a seismic moment. It told everyone watching, the Byzantines, rival beyliks, and the Ottomans themselves, that this little principality was punching above its weight. But Osman wasn't just about war. He was about identity. It was under him that the Ottomans began to craft a sense of who they were. Legends circulated about his just rule, his piety, and of course his prophetic dream. Ah, yes, the dream again. You'll recall the story. Osman dreams of a tree sprouting from his chest, its branches shading the world. His marriage to the daughter of a holy man supposedly sealed his divine right to rule. Whether or not Osman ever dreamed such a thing is irrelevant. What matters is that generations of Ottomans believed it. The myth gave the dynasty legitimacy, a narrative that God himself had marked Osman's descendants for greatness. This myth-making shouldn't be underestimated. The frontier was full of warlords and strongmen who came and went. What distinguished the Ottomans was that they began building a story around themselves. People rally not only to leaders, but to causes and identities. Osman, whether by intention or the cleverness of later chroniclers, gave his principality the seeds of a dynasty. And then there's the name, why Ottomans? Because of Osman. His followers became known as Osmanlı in Turkish, which Western languages turned into Ottoman. That, right there, is the beginning of an imperial brand. Think about how rare that is. One man's name becoming shorthand for a centuries-spanning empire. Osman wasn't just leading raids, he was unknowingly branding one of history's greatest powers. As his years went on, Osman's ambitions grew bolder. He targeted Byzantine towns like Nicaea and Nicomedia, strategic wealthy cities that, if captured, would give the Ottomans direct access to the Sea of Marmara and the gateway to Europe. Osman himself may not have lived to see these campaigns completed, but he set the stage. His death, around 1323 or 1324, left his son Orhan with a principality that was far stronger, more coherent, and more ambitious than the one Ertuğrul had left him. Before Osman's passing, however, he had one last legendary moment. According to later accounts, on his deathbed, he instructed Orhan to take Bursa, a wealthy and strategically vital Byzantine city. Whether he truly said this or not doesn't matter. What matters is that Orhan did exactly that within a few years, and Bursa would become the Ottomans' first major capital. Symbolism and reality aligned. And so Osman Thurns, a man who began as little more than a tribal leader, left behind the blueprint of empire. Fight the Byzantines, settle conquered lands, build legitimacy through religion and myth, and never stop expanding. His name would live on not only in chronicles, but in the very identity of the empire itself. At this stage, the Ottomans were still small. Let's not exaggerate. They weren't yet the terror of Europe, or the nightmare of sultans in Cairo. They were a rising principality, with clever leadership and some lucky breaks. But the crucial transformation had happened. They were no longer just raiders. They were becoming a state, and that state carried the name and the vision of Osman. So when you hear Ottoman Empire, you're hearing not just geography or politics, but the echo of one man's rise from frontier obscurity to dynastic founder. That's Osman's legacy. From here, the Ottomans would only grow more dangerous, more organized, and more ambitious, until even mighty empires trembled at their advance. When Osman's son Orhan took the reins in the 1320s, the Ottomans were at a crossroads. They had grown beyond being just a war band with grazing lands, but they were not yet an empire. Orhan's task was to transform this fragile principality into something more durable. And unlike so many successors who squander what their fathers built, Orhan actually delivered. Under his leadership, the Ottomans began to consolidate their power, build real institutions, and take their first steps toward becoming a state that would last for centuries. You might imagine Orhan as less of a swashbuckling frontier warrior and more of a builder, though he fought plenty of battles himself. His most important achievement came early in his reign, the capture of Bursa in 1326, fulfilling his father's supposed dying wish. If Osman was the founder in spirit, Orhan was the one who gave the Ottomans their first true capital. Bursa wasn't just a military prize, it was an economic jackpot. Sitting at a crossroads of trade routes and boasting fertile lands, Bursa allowed the Ottomans to tap into commerce, silk production, and taxes. Suddenly, they weren't just raiders living off loot, they were rulers, collecting revenues. That was the difference between being a tribe and being a state. And with Bursa came the chance to flex some administrative muscles. Orhan began minting coins in his own name, a classic sign that you've moved from local warlord to recognized sovereign. He organized the army into a more disciplined force, relying not only on tribal cavalry but also on infantry units. He even laid the groundwork for what would later become the famous Janissaries, though in Orhan's day it was far more experimental. Religion, of course, played its role. Orhan sponsored mosques, madrasas, Islamic schools, and charitable foundations, weaving the Ottoman identity ever more tightly into the fabric of Islamic legitimacy. This was clever politics. On one hand, it appealed to the Ghazis who saw their raids as holy warfare. On the other, it reassured Muslim scholars and populations that the Ottomans were not just upstart warlords, but defenders of the faith. But the Ottoman success wasn't just about piety, it was also about pragmatism. Orhan understood that alliances mattered, and one of his most fascinating moves was his marriage to Theodora, the daughter of the Byzantine Emperor John VI Cantacuzene. Think about that, the daughter of a Byzantine emperor marrying the son of Osman. The same Byzantines who had once seen these Turks as little more than pests were now giving their princesses in marriage. This wasn't just a wedding, it was a political statement that the Ottomans were no longer marginal raiders. They were power players. Still, Orhan never forgot the old playbook, expansion. With Bursa secured, he set his sights westward. The Ottomans took Nicaea, Iznik in 1331, and Nicomedia, Izmit, in 1337, steadily eating away at Byzantine strongholds. To you, centuries later, these might just look like dots on a map. But to the Ottomans, each city was a treasure, fortified, wealthy, and strategically vital. Every conquest gave them not only land but prestige. The Byzantines, already crumbling, were now being dismantled one piece at a time by a power no one had seen coming. And then came the big leap, crossing into Europe. In 1354, after a devastating earthquake damaged the walls of Gallipoli, the Ottomans swooped in and occupied the fortress. Just like that, they had a permanent foothold on the European side of the Dardanelles. This was not just another conquest. This was the start of something revolutionary. From here, the Ottomans would push deeper into the Balkans, setting the stage for centuries of conflict and expansion into Europe. It's worth pausing here. Up until now, the Ottomans had been an Anatolian power, but with Gallipoli, they became a transcontinental one. This crossing was a turning point. From now on, they weren't just a regional principality, they were becoming an empire straddling two continents. Orhan's reign also saw the beginning of something more intangible but just as important, a culture of succession. Unlike many Turkic tribes, where leadership often fractured among brothers and cousins, The Ottomans began to consolidate the principle that power would pass from father to son. This was by no means smooth. Future centuries would be drenched in blood over succession disputes. But Orhan's smooth takeover after Osman's death helped establish a precedent of dynastic continuity. Dynasties live and die on whether they can manage succession, and Orhan's relatively peaceful rise set the Ottomans on a stable path. Now, let us be honest, Orhan doesn't get the same glory as Osman or later sultans like Mehmed the Conqueror or Suleiman the Magnificent. He's often overshadowed, but think about what he accomplished. He gave the Ottomans a permanent capital. He expanded their territory into Europe. He built the first institutions of governance and army discipline. He turned his father's raiding band into a proto-state that could collect taxes, mint coins, and marry into imperial dynasties. Without Orhan's consolidation, the Ottomans might have burned bright and faded like so many other frontier powers. And of course, Orhan paved the way for his son Murad, who would take the expansionist baton and run with it. By the time Orhan died in 1362, the Ottomans were no longer just another beylik in Anatolia. They were a rising star whose shadow was beginning to stretch across Europe. If Osman lit the spark, Orhan built the fire pit, arranged the wood and kept the flame alive. The blaze of empire was now inevitable. When Orhan passed the throne to his son Murad I in 1362, the Ottomans were already on the rise. But under Murad and his successors, the fire of expansion roared into an inferno. It's here, in the mid-14th and early 15th centuries, that the Ottomans shifted from promising principality to undeniable empire. And the event that would define this phase, and in many ways the destiny of the entire dynasty, was the conquest of Constantinople in 1453. But before we get there, you need to see how carefully the groundwork was laid. Murad I wasted no time in making his mark. The Balkans were the obvious target, fractured, politically unstable, and filled with petty rulers who could never unite against a common enemy. Perfect conditions for the Ottomans. Murad pushed north and west, fighting a series of campaigns that steadily brought Bulgaria, Serbia, and parts of Greece under Ottoman influence. Unlike many conquerors who simply razed and moved on, the Ottomans had a knack for incorporating. Local rulers could keep their lands, provided they paid tribute and acknowledged Ottoman overlordship. Carrots and sticks, always a winning combination. And Murad did something even more revolutionary. He institutionalized the Janissaries. Now, the Janissary Corps didn't spring up overnight, but Murad turned it into a core institution of Ottoman power. These were elite infantry soldiers, recruited through the Devshirme system, where Christian boys from the Balkans were taken, converted to Islam, and trained as soldiers or administrators. It was harsh, yes, families often hated it, but it created one of the most loyal and disciplined military forces in history. Janissaries owed their power and position directly to the Sultan, not to tribal or local loyalties. This was genius. By breaking free of reliance on traditional tribal cavalry, the Ottomans built a standing army centuries before it became fashionable in Europe. Murad's campaigns climaxed at the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, a clash that became legendary for both Ottomans and Serbs. The battle itself was brutal and inconclusive in some ways. Both sides took heavy losses, but the Ottomans emerged with the strategic advantage. Murad himself was killed in the aftermath, famously assassinated on the battlefield. Yet his death did not derail Ottoman momentum. Succession was managed, bloody as always but functional, and his son Bayezid I took the throne. Bayezid, nicknamed the Thunderbolt, was as fierce as his epithet suggests. He continued pounding the Balkans, bringing more territory under Ottoman sway, and even set his sights on Constantinople. For decades, the Ottomans had been tightening the noose around the Byzantine capital, capturing its surrounding towns and fortresses, cutting off its lifelines. By the 1390s, Constantinople was essentially a city under siege, surviving only through desperate alliances and support from the West. But fate had other plans. In 1402, at the Battle of Ankara, Bayezid met Timur, yes, Tamerlane himself, and the Ottomans were utterly crushed. Bayezid was captured, reportedly held in a cage, and died shortly after. The empire collapsed into chaos. This was the first great crisis of the Ottomans, known as the Ottoman Interregnum. For over a decade, Bayezid's sons fought each other for control, while their rivals circled like vultures. Many empires would have died right here, torn apart by civil war and external enemies. But the Ottomans didn't die. They clawed their way back. By 1413, one of Bayezid's sons, Mehmed I, restored order and reunified the state. His reign was about stabilization more than expansion, patching up the cracks that Ankara had left. His successor, Murad II, brought the Ottomans back onto the offensive, fighting renewed wars in the Balkans and Anatolia. It wasn't always smooth. Defeats like Varna in 1444 showed that the Ottomans weren't invincible, but by the mid-15th century they were back on solid footing. And then, in 1451, came the man who would change history forever, Mehmed II, better known as Mehmed the Conqueror. He was just 19 when he ascended the throne, but he had vision, ambition, and the will to make it happen. His target was clear: Constantinople. For over 1,000 years, the city had stood as the jewel of Byzantium, the heir of Rome, and the bulwark of Christendom in the East. Dozens had tried and failed to take it. Mehmed was determined to succeed. The siege began in April 1453, and it was nothing like the old medieval assaults. Mehmed brought modern firepower, massive cannons, including the monstrous bombard designed by a Hungarian engineer named Orban, which could hurl stone balls weighing hundreds of pounds. Day after day, the walls of Constantinople shook under the pounding of artillery. At the same time, Mehmed used naval blockades to choke off the city, dragging ships over land to bypass the great chain that defended the Golden Horn. It was audacity, technology, and persistence all working together. On May 29, 1453, after weeks of relentless assault, the Ottomans broke through. Constantinople fell. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine V, died fighting on the walls, and with him the Byzantine Empire ended. For Mehmed it was the ultimate triumph, for the Ottomans it was a transformation. No longer were they just another empire among many, they were now the heirs of Rome itself. Mehmed proclaimed Constantinople the new capital, renaming it Istanbul, and set about turning it into a city worthy of empire. Mosques rose, markets flourished, and the city became a cosmopolitan hub of East and West. The fall of Constantinople was not just a military conquest, it was a psychological earthquake. To Europe, it was a catastrophe. The bastion of Christianity in the East had fallen to Islam. To the Ottomans, it was destiny fulfilled. Mehmed the Conqueror had not only avenged centuries of failed sieges, but also announced to the world that the Ottoman Empire was here to stay, and it was here to dominate. From this point on, the Ottomans weren't merely expanding, they were building an empire of civilization, one foot in Europe, the other in Asia, their capital standing as the crossroads of the world. The era of modest frontier beginnings was over. The age of empire had truly begun. With the fall of Constantinople behind them, the Ottomans now stood as a true empire. And yet, if you really want to see the Ottomans at their absolute peak, in terms of military might, cultural brilliance, and sheer swagger, you have to move forward to the reign of Suleiman, better known to history as Suleiman the Magnificent. His era, stretching from 1520 to 1566, is the so-called Golden Age of the Ottoman Empire. When their borders reached their greatest extent, their culture sparkled, and their legal and political institutions solidified in ways that would endure for centuries. Now, it's worth noting, Suleiman didn't rise from obscurity. By the time he took the throne, the Ottomans had already become a formidable world power. Mehmed, the Conqueror, had taken Constantinople. Bayezid II had consolidated. Selim I, Suleiman's father, had expanded east and south, seizing Egypt and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. By 1520, when Suleiman became Sultan, the empire was already massive. But under him, it became something even more, a superpower that dominated not only the map, but also the imagination of friend and foe alike. Suleiman's reign can be divided into two great themes: conquest and culture. Let's start with the conquest, because, well, it's dramatic. Within just a year of becoming Sultan, Suleiman struck hard at Hungary, one of Europe's key defenses against Ottoman expansion. At the Battle of Mohacs in 1526, the Ottomans annihilated the Hungarian army in a battle so devastating that Hungary ceased to exist as an independent kingdom. Imagine that, in one day, a nation was shattered. But Suleiman wasn't content with just Mohacs. He marched on Vienna in 1529, laying siege to the Habsburg capital. And here's where we see the limits of Ottoman expansion. Vienna held out thanks to weather, fortifications, and sheer desperation. The Ottomans would never conquer the Austrian heartland, but the message was clear. Ottoman armies could strike deep into Central Europe, and no Christian power felt safe. For centuries afterward, Vienna would stand as the symbolic line between Ottoman East and Christian West. Meanwhile, in the East, Suleiman was busy too. He clashed with the Safavid Empire of Persia, that other great Islamic superpower, fighting a series of wars that secured much of Mesopotamia for the Ottomans. Baghdad, that jewel of Islamic civilization, came under Ottoman rule, further cementing their legitimacy as leaders of the Muslim world. By controlling the holy cities in Arabia and the intellectual centers of the Middle East, Suleiman could claim a kind of spiritual authority that few rulers in history have ever matched. And then, of course, there was the sea. Under admirals like Barbarossa Hayreddin Pasha, the Ottomans dominated the Mediterranean. Their fleets battled Spain and Venice, raiding as far west as the coasts of Italy and France. The Mediterranean, once called a Roman lake, was now in many ways an Ottoman lake. In the Red Sea and Indian Ocean, Ottoman fleets even squared off against the Portuguese, trying to control the spice routes and global trade. This was empire on a planetary scale. But conquest, while flashy, was only half of Suleiman's greatness. The other half lay in how he governed. He wasn't called the lawgiver for nothing. Suleiman oversaw a vast codification of laws, harmonizing Sharia, Islamic law, with Qanun, sultanic decrees, to create a coherent legal system. This might sound dry, but it mattered immensely. An empire that spanned 3 continents and dozens of cultures needed consistency. Suleiman's legal reforms made the Ottoman system more predictable, more stable, and more just, at least by the standards of the day. And then there was culture. Under Suleiman, Istanbul blossomed into a world capital of art, architecture, and learning. The architect Mimar Sinan, the Michelangelo of the Ottoman world, designed mosques and palaces whose domes and minarets still define Istanbul's skyline today. Calligraphy, poetry, textiles and ceramics flourished, blending Islamic, Persian and Byzantine influences into something uniquely Ottoman. If you were to stroll through the markets of Istanbul during Suleiman's reign, you'd find spices from India, silks from China, gold from Africa, and scholars debating theology, philosophy, and science. It was cosmopolitanism at its finest. Even the imperial harem, so often sensationalized in later depictions, played a central role in politics and culture. Suleiman's consort, Hurrem Sultan, Roxelana, wielded immense influence, breaking traditions by marrying the Sultan and becoming his trusted advisor. Their partnership reshaped palace politics, and Hürrem herself became a powerful patron of architecture and charity. Far from being a secluded world of idle luxury, the harem was a political engine, producing alliances, intrigue, and cultural patronage. Of course, even golden ages have shadows. The Ottoman system of succession, where brothers often killed each other to prevent civil war, was brutal. Suleiman himself oversaw the execution of his beloved son Mustafa, accused of plotting rebellion. His later years were marked by personal grief, palace intrigue, and the strains of ruling such a vast empire. And yet, even in decline, Suleiman remained formidable. He died in 1566 while on campaign in Hungary, still leading armies at the age of 71. By the time of his death, the Ottoman Empire stretched from Hungary to Iraq, from Yemen to Algeria. It was, without exaggeration, the superpower of the 16th century. European monarchs feared and envied him. Eastern rivals respected and dreaded him. Within his own empire, he was remembered as both a warrior and a lawgiver, a man who embodied the idea of Ottoman greatness. So when you think of the Ottomans at their height, think of Suleiman, a ruler who could humble kings in battle draft laws that shaped millions of lives, commission mosques that still awe visitors today, and preside over a court where poets and scholars thrived. His reign was not just the high point of Ottoman history, it was one of the pinnacles of world history. After Suleiman, the Ottomans would still be powerful, but the seeds of stagnation were already being sown. For now, though, in the mid-16th century, you are standing in the empire of Suleiman the Magnificent, and the horizon seems limitless. When Suleiman the Magnificent died in 1566, the Ottoman Empire was at its zenith. But here's the thing about zeniths: once you hit the peak, the only way left is down. And while the decline of the Ottomans would take centuries, it wasn't some overnight collapse. The period after Suleiman saw the beginning of strains, cracks, and stagnation that would gradually weaken the empire from within and without. This is the era where the Ottomans still looked powerful, but beneath the surface, the gears were grinding less smoothly. The most immediate problem: succession. Suleiman left behind a system that was, well, brutal, but effective in preventing civil war. Ottoman princes, known as Shehzadis, were raised in provincial governorships, and when their father died, they basically fought it out for the throne. Losers were often strangled with a bowstring. No royal blood could be spilled, and that kept things efficient. Cold-blooded, sure, but it meant only the strongest rose to the top. After Suleiman, though, this system started to rot. Later sultans became more sheltered, raised in the harem instead of the provinces, kept away from real governance, and often thrust onto the throne without experience. Instead of battle-hardened rulers like Mehmed or Suleiman, you started getting pampered palace kids. Not a great trade-off. One prime example is Selim II, Suleiman's son. Nicknamed Selim the Sot or Selim the Drunkard, he was far more interested in wine and leisure than leading armies. Under him, power shifted more and more to viziers and court factions. This wasn't entirely bad. The Grand Vizier Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, for instance, was an able statesman who kept the ship steady, but it marked a clear shift. The Sultan was no longer always the driving force of the empire. Militarily, the Ottomans still packed a punch, but they weren't invincible. The Battle of Lepanto in 1571 was a turning point. A coalition of European powers, the Holy League, smashed the Ottoman fleet in one of the largest naval battles of the age. The Ottomans rebuilt quickly, they always did, but the psychological blow was real. The myth of Ottoman naval supremacy had cracked. At the same time, the empire was expanding beyond what was realistically governable. The provinces stretched across 3 continents, and communication, taxation, and enforcement all became harder. Local governors often acted like little kings, enriching themselves while sending the bare minimum back to Istanbul. Corruption seeped into the bureaucracy. Tax farming, where officials auctioned off the right to collect taxes, became a nightmare for peasants, who were squeezed dry by greedy intermediaries. And then there were the Janissaries. Once the elite backbone of the army, they gradually became a problem. Over time, the strict devshirme system loosened. Positions in the Janissaries were sold or inherited, and discipline eroded. What was once a feared professional corps became a bloated, entitled class that demanded higher pay, resisted reforms, and occasionally overthrew sultans who didn't meet their demands. Imagine if your best soldiers doubled as a politically volatile labor union, not exactly stable. Culturally, though, the empire still thrived. The 17th century saw stunning architecture, literature, and art continue to flourish. Istanbul remained a bustling cosmopolitan hub, but culturally vibrant doesn't necessarily mean politically strong, and that contrast became sharper as the decades wore on. The Ottomans also faced new external pressures. In Europe, their enemies were getting stronger and more centralized. The Habsburgs in Austria and Spain consolidated their power. In the north, Russia began to rise, eyeing Ottoman territory. In the east, the Safavid Empire remained a constant rival. And then there was the slow but steady advance of European maritime powers: Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, and later Britain and France, whose overseas empires gradually undercut Ottoman control of trade. When European merchants could sail directly to India and bypass Ottoman intermediaries, it was like the empire had been cut out of the world's economic mainframe. And yet, calling this period pure decline oversimplifies things. Historians today often push back against the old decline narrative, pointing out that the Ottomans adapted, survived, and even thrived in certain areas. The 17th century saw major administrative reforms, fiscal adjustments, and moments of military resurgence. The empire didn't collapse, far from it, but the effortless dominance of the Suleiman era was gone. Instead, the Ottomans had to claw, compromise, and sometimes just hang on. The Battle of Vienna in 1683 is another symbolic moment. Once again, the Ottomans besieged Vienna, this time under Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa, and once again they failed, spectacularly. A combined European relief army, including the famous Polish King John III Sobieski, crushed the Ottoman forces. From then on, the tide in Europe really started turning against them. The following decades saw the empire lose ground in Hungary and the Balkans, territories that had been the bedrock of its European expansion. Internally, palace intrigue became almost theatrical. Sultans came and went, often deposed by janissaries or poisoned in palace plots. The so-called Sultanate of Women, where queen mothers and consorts wielded enormous influence, shaped policy from behind the scenes. In a way, this reflected the empire's adaptability, as power shifted to whoever could actually wield it. But it also underscored the erosion of centralized, sultan-driven leadership. So this era, roughly the late 16th through the 17th century, wasn't the dramatic collapse some old textbooks make it out to be. But it was a time when the Ottoman machine started sputtering. Military setbacks, corrupt administration, rebellious elites, and stronger external rivals all combined to weaken the empire's edge. The Ottomans were still very much a great power, but they were no longer the unstoppable juggernaut that Europe had once feared. By 1700, the world was changing fast. Gunpowder empires like the Ottomans had to deal with the new age of centralized nation-states, global trade networks, and scientific revolutions. For the Ottomans, keeping up was going to be the challenge of the next 2 centuries. And as you'll see, they tried with reform after reform, but each effort ran headfirst into the weight of tradition, vested interests, and the sheer size of the empire itself. By the dawn of the 18th century, the Ottomans were still standing, still massive, but no longer the terrifying force that had once kept European kings up at night. Instead, they had become the old empire of Europe, respected, feared in certain moments, but increasingly seen as outdated, lumbering, and vulnerable. This is the era of reform and resistance, two forces constantly clashing as the Ottomans tried to adapt to a rapidly changing world. Let's start with the 18th century itself. After the disastrous defeat at Vienna in 1683 and the subsequent Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699, the empire had to swallow its first major territorial losses in Europe. Hungary and parts of the Balkans slipped away, and with them, the illusion of endless expansion. For the first time in centuries, the Ottomans were definitively on the defensive. And yet, this period wasn't just decline and misery. In fact, the early 18th century saw something historians call the Tulip Era, 1718-1730. The name might sound whimsical, tulips, really, but it symbolized a moment of cultural flowering and cautious modernization. The elite of Istanbul became obsessed with tulips as a status symbol, building elaborate gardens, hosting festivals, and importing new varieties. Behind the tulip craze, though, there were deeper currents: diplomatic embassies to European capitals, printing presses starting to operate in Ottoman lands, and a growing fascination with European science and technology. It was a brief, fragile era of experimentation, and unsurprisingly, it ended in revolt. The Patrona Halil rebellion of 1730, led by angry janissaries and conservative factions, smashed the tulip dream, deposing the Sultan and reminding everyone that reform was always a risky business in a tradition-bound empire. Still, reformist impulses never went away. Throughout the 18th century, the Ottomans tinkered with their military and administration, trying to catch up with the Europeans, who were surging ahead thanks to centralized states, better armies, and the early rumblings of the Industrial Revolution. The Ottomans had once been the vanguard of gunpowder warfare. Now they were falling behind. Artillery, drill tactics, fortifications. The Europeans innovated faster. Ottoman leaders, often painfully aware of this gap, attempted to hire European advisors, import weapons, and retrain their armies. But every reform ran headlong into opposition from the Janissaries, who had become the ultimate conservative force. They didn't want change, they wanted to protect their privileges. Externally, the empire faced an increasingly hostile environment. Russia, under rulers like Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, expanded southward with relentless ambition, clashing with the Ottomans again and again. The Black Sea, once an Ottoman lake, gradually became a Russian playground. Austria, too, kept pressing in from the west. Piece by piece, the Ottoman frontier in Europe was chipped away. Then came the 19th century, and things got really messy. This is the era of the Tanzimat reforms, 1839-1876, a sweeping attempt to modernize the empire along European lines. New legal codes were introduced, schools were reformed, railroads were built, and even clothing styles began to shift. The idea was to centralize power, strengthen the state, and make all subjects, Muslim and non-Muslim alike, equal before the law. It was ambitious, and it showed that the Ottomans weren't blind to the winds of change, but again, resistance was fierce. Conservative clerics, traditional elites, and yes, the ever-problematic Janissaries resisted these reforms tooth and nail. The Janissaries were finally destroyed in 1826 during the so-called auspicious incident when Sultan Mahmud II had enough of their obstruction and wiped them out in a bloody crackdown. It was brutal but necessary. Only by eliminating this entrenched core could the Ottomans even attempt real modernization. Yet while the Ottomans struggled to reform internally, nationalist movements began tearing them apart from the inside. Inspired by European ideas of nationalism and spurred on by local grievances, subject peoples in the Balkans started demanding independence. The Greeks rose up in the 1820s, eventually winning independence with help from Britain, France, and Russia. Serbs, Bulgarians, Romanians, and others would follow in the 19th century, each rebellion chipping away at the empire's European core. This wasn't just about lost land, it was about the empire's very identity. For centuries, the Ottomans had ruled over a diverse mix of peoples and religions under the umbrella of imperial order. Nationalism shattered that model, and the Ottomans couldn't put the genie back in the bottle. Meanwhile, the so-called Eastern question, what to do about the sick man of Europe, as the Ottomans were increasingly called, became a central issue in international politics. Britain, France, Russia, and later Germany all had stakes in Ottoman lands, especially as the empire's strategic position grew ever more important in the age of global empires and industrialized warfare. The Crimean War, 1853-1856, is a perfect example. Britain and France actually fought alongside the Ottomans to stop Russia from carving them up too soon. It was less about saving the Ottomans and more about maintaining balance in Europe. Culturally, the empire was a fascinating hybrid in this period. Western-style universities, newspapers, and political movements sprouted up in Istanbul and other cities. Intellectuals debated constitutionalism, Islam, and modernity. The empire even briefly experimented with a constitution and parliament in 1876 under Sultan Abdulhamid II, though he suspended it soon after. The struggle between reform and autocracy, tradition and modernization, became the defining drama of late Ottoman politics. But make no mistake, by the late 19th century, the empire was staggering. The Balkan Wars, endless uprisings, foreign debts, and humiliating defeats all piled up. Still, it's important to stress that the Ottomans didn't just roll over and die. They kept adapting, reforming, and resisting right up until the very end. When people call them the sick man, they sometimes forget how long that sick man kept hobbling along. By the early 20th century, though, the storm clouds of global conflict were gathering. The Ottoman Empire, battered and bruised, was about to be pulled into a war that would finish the job centuries of slow decline had started. And when that war ended, so would the Ottomans. By the turn of the 20th century, the Ottoman Empire was a shadow of its former self. Once stretching from Budapest to Baghdad, it now clung desperately to Anatolia, parts of the Middle East, and a few scraps of European territory. The empire that had outlasted Crusaders, Mongols, and countless dynasties was entering its final act, and it would not go quietly. The first 2 decades of the 1900s were defined by both reform and chaos. In 1908, the Young Turk Revolution erupted. The Young Turks, a group of reform-minded military officers and intellectuals, forced Sultan Abdulhamid II to restore the constitution and parliament he had shelved decades earlier. For a brief moment, there was hope. Constitutional monarchy, modernization, maybe even revival. But politics in the Ottoman Empire were never that simple. Factions within the Young Turks soon split, and power fell largely into the hands of the Committee of Union and Progress, CUP. These were men determined to centralize the state and Turkify the empire, which meant promoting Turkish identity at the expense of the empire's other ethnic groups. Not surprisingly, this didn't sit well with Armenians, Arabs, Greeks, and others who had already been flirting with nationalist movements of their own. Meanwhile, external crises piled up. The Balkan Wars, 1912-1913, were devastating. The empire lost almost all of its remaining European territory in a matter of months, including its Balkan heartlands that had been under Ottoman rule for centuries. Refugees poured into Anatolia, the treasury bled, and morale crumbled. For many, this was the point when the empire truly lost its footing. And then came the cataclysm, World War I. The Ottomans, desperate for allies and fearful of being carved up, sided with Germany and Austria-Hungary. It was a gamble, and spoiler alert, it didn't pay off. Ottoman armies fought bravely in multiple theaters, against the British in Mesopotamia and Palestine, against the Russians in the Caucasus, and most famously against the Allied invasion at Gallipoli in 1915. At Gallipoli, Ottoman forces under commanders like Mustafa Kemal, later Ataturk, repelled one of the most ambitious amphibious assaults in history. It was a rare moment of triumph, one that would become legendary in Turkish memory. But victories like Gallipoli couldn't mask the wider disaster. The war bled the empire dry. Worse, it unleashed some of its darkest chapters. The Ottoman leadership, paranoid about Armenian collaboration with the Russians, initiated mass deportations and killings of Armenians in 1915-1916, what is now widely recognized as the Armenian Genocide. Hundreds of thousands perished in forced marches, massacres, and starvation. It remains one of the most tragic and controversial legacies of the empire's collapse. By 1918, the writing was on the wall. The Ottoman military was exhausted, its people starving, its lands overrun. The empire signed the Armistice of Mudros, effectively surrendering. Soon after, Allied troops occupied Istanbul. The once proud capital of the Sultans was now under foreign control. The final blow came with the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920, which carved up Ottoman lands like a cake at a European dinner party. Greece occupied western Anatolia, France took parts of the south, Britain grabbed Palestine and Mesopotamia, and Italy eyed the coasts. Even Istanbul was set to become an international zone. It was humiliation on a scale that stunned the Ottoman public. And yet, out of this humiliation rose resistance. In Anatolia, a movement led by Mustafa Kemal, the same Gallipoli hero, began rallying Turks against foreign occupation. This sparked the Turkish War of Independence, 1919-1923. Against all odds, Kemal's forces pushed back the Greeks, resisted the Allies, and forged a new state out of the ashes of empire. In 1922, the Ottoman Sultanate was formally abolished. The last Sultan, Mehmed VI, fled Istanbul on a British warship, a pitiful end for a dynasty that had once ruled 3 continents. In 1923, the Republic of Turkey was proclaimed, with Mustafa Kemal Ataturk as its first president. The Caliphate, once the symbolic head of the Muslim world, lingered for a couple more years, but was abolished in 1924. The Ottoman Empire, which had lasted over 6 centuries, was no more. So, what's the legacy? It's complicated. On one hand, the Ottomans are remembered for conquest, grandeur, and a cosmopolitan culture that blended East and West. Their architecture still stands, their cuisine still delights, their laws and institutions still echo in modern Turkey and beyond. On the other hand, their later centuries were marked by stagnation, oppression, and eventual collapse. For Europeans, they were long the terrifying Turks at the gates. For many of their subjects, they were both rulers and occupiers. For modern Turks, they are both a source of pride and a cautionary tale. In the end, the Ottoman Empire was one of history's great experiments, a state that ruled across continents, cultures, and centuries. Its rise was meteoric, its peak dazzling, and its fall tragic. But like all great empires, it shaped the world in ways that still linger, in borders, in cities, in memory. And though it is gone, the shadow of the Ottomans still stretches across history, impossible to ignore. And so, you've walked through more than 600 years of Ottoman history, from a ragtag Turkic tribe on the frontier of Anatolia to a sprawling empire that once threatened Vienna, ruled Mecca, and dominated the Mediterranean, and finally to its dissolution after World War I. It's a story that's equal parts inspiring, terrifying, tragic, and astonishing. Think of what the Ottomans witnessed: the end of the Byzantine Empire, the age of Columbus, and Da Vinci, the rise of Napoleon, the dawn of the industrial world, and the catastrophe of the First World War. They weren't just participants in history. For centuries, they were shaping it. What makes the Ottomans so fascinating is their ability to endure. Few empires last even a couple of centuries, yet the Ottomans survived for more than 600 years. They adapted, sometimes clumsily, sometimes brilliantly, to changing times. They left behind art, architecture, cuisine, traditions and institutions that still define modern Turkey and influence the broader Middle East and Balkans today. Of course, it's also a cautionary tale. The Ottomans remind us that no empire, no matter how powerful, is invincible. Complacency, corruption and resistance to reform gradually ate away at their strength. By the time the modern world arrived with its factories, railroads and nationalist revolutions, the Ottomans were already staggering. And yet, to reduce their story to decline and collapse misses the point. The Ottomans weren't just the sick man of Europe. They were builders of cities, patrons of learning and rulers of extraordinary diversity. Their empire was one of history's greatest bridges between East and West, Islam and Christendom, tradition and modernity. The empire is gone, but its echoes remain, and that, perhaps, is the real mark of greatness.